Imagine the silence of a medieval bedroom. Stone walls, straw-stuffed mattress, the scent of candle wax and cold iron. And in that still, uncomfortable silence, there's a girl, wrapped in a linen shift, waiting. Not for romance, not for love, but for blood. Because in the Middle Ages, the first night of marriage wasn't about celebration, it was about evidence. A visible stain on a sheet, a cloth, a dress was considered proof of virginity. No stain, no innocence, no dowry, no future. For centuries across medieval Europe, this single biological myth dictated the fates of women of every class, from peasant girls in farm cottages to noble women in castle chambers. Virginity wasn't just about chastity or morals, it was about economics, power, and property transfer. A bride without proof could be accused of dishonoring her family, or worse, of having deceived her husband. And deception, in a religiously obsessed society, was a dangerous charge. Especially when the truth didn't matter, only the stain did. Now, let's slow down here. In medieval medical theory, based largely on ancient Greek ideas, virginity was linked to a concept called the hymen, a thin membrane, they believed, that tore during first intercourse, causing bleeding. But in reality, bleeding on the wedding night is not guaranteed. Some women do, many don't. It depends on anatomy, activity, age, and countless other factors. And yet, no one wanted to hear that, because this wasn't a world interested in science, it was a world ruled by symbolism, superstition, and public shame. If the wedding sheets were clean the next morning, the husband could declare the marriage unconsummated. He might take the bride back to her father, refuse her dowry, demand an annulment. In some cases, she might be punished or imprisoned. In others, she could be executed for fraud or adultery, even if she was in fact a virgin. Now imagine being a girl of 15 or 16. You've never seen a man naked. You've never been told how your body works, and your entire future, your status, your safety, your marriage, depends on producing blood you might not even have. No pressure, right? But here's the part that makes this truly surreal. Everyone knew it could be faked, and very often it was. Behind closed doors, mothers whispered strategies. Midwives shared secrets. Merchants even sold special cloths pre-stained with animal blood. It became a kind of quiet survival industry, an open secret, a performance staged between the sheets with life or death stakes. Before we explore how women faked virginity and how midwives helped them do it, it's important to understand that the whole system was built on a lie, one that medieval men pretended to believe and medieval women were forced to perform. This wasn't just about biology, it was about ownership. A bride's purity was considered her family's honor, and the husband, by breaking her, was symbolically claiming her body as his property. If that didn't happen, if she was already broken, then someone else had used what was now supposed to belong to him. The obsession with blood was about power, control, legacy, and inheritance. It's no coincidence that these customs were strongest in societies where women couldn't inherit property, couldn't testify in court, or couldn't refuse marriage. If a woman had no legal identity outside of her husband, then her virginity became the only thing that could be verified, owned, or lost. So, the next time you hear someone talking about old-fashioned values, remember this. Medieval Europe turned virginity into a public ritual of humiliation, and women, clever, desperate, determined, found ways to outsmart it. In this story, sheep's blood, wine-stained cloth, concealed knives, and even herbs that induce bleeding will play a part, because survival in the Middle Ages wasn't always about sword and shield. Sometimes it came down to a carefully placed stain and a perfectly timed lie. If you're enjoying this quiet journey through medieval madness, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe before we go deeper. And tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening from? We've only just begun. Let's talk logistics. Because faking virginity in the Middle Ages wasn't just a one-time trick, it was a full-bodied performance, and the stakes were terrifying. A woman who failed to convince her new husband, and sometimes his entire family, could be shamed, punished, or abandoned. So, what did she do? She prepared. Sometimes for weeks in advance. The most common method? Sheep's blood. In towns across medieval Europe, midwives and wise women would quietly prepare vials or cloths stained with blood drawn from animals, often sheep, occasionally doves, sometimes even a woman's own blood. Just before the wedding night, the bride might hide the cloth in the bed frame, or stitch it inside her shift, or tuck it beneath her thighs before the husband entered the room. If she could smuggle it out at the right moment, just as the room went dark, she'd crush it against the sheets or let the liquid run subtly into the fabric. The result? A perfectly placed stain, the proof everyone expected. In some cases, the blood wasn't even red. It might be rust-colored, or too dark, or the wrong consistency. But that didn't matter, because most people didn't want to know the truth. They just wanted something to see. Still, not everyone had access to animal blood or the help of a trusted midwife. So some women got more creative. A drop of red wine, smashed berries, a pricked finger, even cutting the inside of the thigh with a tiny blade, just enough to leave a streak and a scar. A literal blood sacrifice. It sounds horrifying, and it was. But in a world where one clean sheet could destroy a life, women adapted. In many Mediterranean cultures, the next morning's linens were publicly displayed, sometimes hung from windows or handed to a mother-in-law. They weren't just private evidence, they were political banners. So imagine the pressure. A teenager, married off to a man she barely knows, is expected to perform under threat of banishment, annulment, or violence. She's been told her entire life that everything depends on this moment. And now, alone in a dark room, she's fumbling for a hidden rag soaked in goat blood, hoping no one notices the smell. And here's the part no one wants to say. Many men knew. Husbands, especially wealthy or educated ones, were not all fooled by these tricks, but often they chose not to say anything. Why? Because calling it out would cause scandal. It would involve families, legal cases, church courts, and if the husband did want to divorce or annul, he might have to return the dowry. So long as the illusion was maintained, everyone could go home satisfied. The woman was proven, the man's honor was intact, and the family name stayed clean. In that sense, the entire system was a form of collective performance. And for those too poor to buy fake blood or too alone to get help, they had to improvise.
Folk manuals from the 14th and 15th centuries, written by physicians, midwives, and monks, describe mixtures of herbs that could stimulate slight internal bleeding. Some advised women to insert crushed nettles or other irritants into the vagina, causing swelling, tightness, or even minor abrasions that could simulate a wound. Others used ice-cold water baths to tighten the body, or fasted for days before the wedding to reduce any looseness. Some even rehearsed how to cry, how to whimper, how to breathe. The goal was to look innocent, frightened, yes, but virginally fragile, as though the pain was new. Because make no mistake, in many cases, it wasn't the lack of blood that mattered most, it was the act. How a woman appeared during and after the wedding night carried as much weight as any cloth. If she seemed too confident, too calm, too experienced, suspicion would follow her like smoke, and medieval gossip was relentless. This is why in some regions, families staged entire rituals before the wedding. They might display the bride, covered head to toe in pale linens and flowers, like a living sacrifice. Some were bathed in wine, some were prayed over. Some were locked in rooms for days before the wedding, preserving their chastity through isolation. All of it for a stain. And what's perhaps most painful to realize is that no one ever asked what the woman wanted. Was she in love? Was she ready? Did she even want to be there? None of that mattered. The only thing that counted was whether she could bleed on cue. So, she prepared. She learned. She whispered. She practiced. Because in the Middle Ages, performing virginity wasn't just an act of survival, it was an act of genius.
If you were a young woman in medieval Europe and your wedding night was approaching, you needed more than prayers. You needed a midwife. And not just any midwife. You needed one who could whisper secrets through candlelight. Someone who had been there, who had helped others. Someone who could make a cloth bleed without the girl doing so herself. In many villages, there were women known not only for delivering babies, but for delivering virginity on demand. These were midwives, herbalists, cunning women, often feared, sometimes respected, always quietly consulted. And over the years, they developed a kind of toolkit. Not a literal box, mind you, but a collection of tricks, recipes, and rituals passed from one knowing woman to another. Let's take a peek inside. At the heart of the toolkit, blood, usually from a sheep, but also chickens, doves, rabbits, even the midwife herself if needed. The blood would be prepared in advance, mixed with a bit of wine or vinegar to keep it from spoiling, soaked into small squares of linen, and then dried, folded, hidden. Some midwives taught brides how to react when their husband entered the room, where to place the stained cloth, how to shift her body, when to cry, what to say. Because faking virginity wasn't just about evidence, it was about performance. If the bride seemed too calm, too confident, she might be accused. If she cried too much, she might be called dramatic. So the midwife would walk her through every step. Wait until he leaves the room. Place the cloth under your hip. Twist your robe so it looks wrinkled.
When he returns, sit still, don't smile. In some regions, midwives even supplied herbal remedies, mixtures that caused light bleeding or vaginal tightening. One popular preparation included nettle root, alum powder, and dried dog rose petals. It was steeped in wine and used as a wash a day or two before the wedding. The goal? Slight irritation, redness, swelling. It sounds brutal, and in many ways it was. But in a world that demanded pain as proof, women learned to produce it. And midwives were their allies. But this wasn't just back-alley magic. In some medieval cities, midwives became so trusted that they were officially licensed. Churches and city councils approved certain women to perform medical and ceremonial functions. And while most of their work focused on childbirth, they were also called to inspect women's bodies, to testify to a bride's integrity, or to restore it. There are records from Spain, Italy, and France where midwives were hired to repair the hymen, using vinegar compressions, stitching, or herbal infusions to make the woman appear virginal again. Let's be clear, this wasn't cosmetic surgery. This was social survival. A girl who had been assaulted or who had previously had consensual sex could still be married off as pure if the midwife worked her magic well enough. In return, midwives were paid in coin, food, wool, or favors, and they had power, quiet, invisible, yet formidable. Power that came not from laws, but from knowledge. They knew how the body worked. They knew what herbs to use, what cloths to stain, how to distract a husband. And in many cases, they were the only ones telling the bride what to expect. In a culture where fathers, priests, and husbands held the official power, midwives held the hidden power. They were the keepers of bleeding cloths, whispered strategies, and hushed rituals. Their fingers stitched wounds no one talked about. Their words comforted girls whose only worth was a stain on a sheet. And their tools? So simple. A small piece of cloth, a pinch of dried rose petal, a cooled mixture of vinegar and nettle, a whispered script, a knowing glance. None of it looked like power. But to the bride on the edge of ruin, it was everything. Sometimes the plan didn't work. There was no cloth, no blood, no performance, just silence and waiting. Maybe the cloth was misplaced. Maybe the blood had dried. Maybe the bride simply didn't know what to do. Or maybe she thought it wouldn't matter. But in the Middle Ages, it often did. Because in that world, appearances meant everything. If there was no stain, people assumed the worst, no matter the truth. A young woman might be returned to her family with quiet disappointment. Whispers might follow her in the village. She might be told to keep to herself, to stay indoors for a while, to step back from public life. Sometimes her family would gently question her or simply avoid speaking about it altogether. And in more formal circles like noble courts, the consequences could involve lost dowries or uncertain futures. In many communities, it wasn't cruelty that followed her. It was silence, a kind of gentle disappearance. She might not be welcomed back into celebrations. She might not be offered a second chance. Her name, once spoken with excitement, would grow quieter in conversation. People would say she had fallen from grace, but what they really meant was that she didn't bleed on command. And for many girls, that was the most painful part. The fact that no one asked what had really happened. No one asked if she had tried, if she was scared, if she understood what was expected. The assumption was simple: no stain, no innocence. And that assumption carried quiet consequences. She might not be allowed to marry again, or if she did, it might be under different terms: less celebration, fewer guests, more uncertainty. She might move in with distant relatives, or enter religious life, or simply fade into the background of her own story. All of this without proof of wrongdoing, only the absence of a mark. And still, the expectation continued. In some places, linen sheets were even displayed the next morning, a quiet symbol of family pride or of social standing. The pressure to pass wasn't always harsh, but it was constant. There are old stories, songs, verses and prayers written by women in convents and quiet corners of history. They speak of a bed that forgot its duty, or a cloth that carried no memory. Words full of quiet grief and quiet strength. Because when it didn't work, when the evidence was missing, the woman was left with silence. Not always cruelty, not always shame, but a kind of stillness, a space where her voice was no longer needed. And in a world that often defined women by what they could prove, silence was its own kind of exile. Still, not every story ended that way. Some women were believed. Some husbands looked past it. Some families stood firm. But even then, the memory remained. It might resurface years later in a disagreement, or be whispered again during another woman's wedding. A quiet question: do you remember what happened to her? And of course, the same pressure never applied to men. They were rarely asked about their past. Their innocence wasn't measured. No stains were required. No questions asked. This imbalance was understood, quietly, universally. And for the women who didn't meet the standard, there was often no place to explain, no second trial, no appeal. Only the expectation that they would step back and make room for the stories society preferred. Stories with proof, stories with blood, stories with silence.
The ritual of blood on the sheets has vanished from modern weddings, but the idea behind it, the need to prove, to perform, to be believed, still lingers.
Even now, in parts of the world, women are expected to provide evidence of purity. Virginity tests, public ceremonies, hymen reconstructions, fake bleeding kits sold online under names like virgin soap, honor packs, or bridal proof. It's 2025, but the ghost of the medieval bedroom still hovers. Because the stain wasn't just physical, it was cultural, a mark that clung to a woman's body, her name, her worth. In the Middle Ages, that stain decided everything. A clean sheet could ruin a marriage. A bloody one could preserve honor, dowry, and dignity, even if it was faked. And no one questioned it, because the truth was too messy, too uncomfortable, too complicated for a world that preferred black and white, or red and white. What's striking is how complicit the system was. Men, women, priests, midwives, everyone played along, not because they believed it was accurate, but because it held society together. If everyone agreed that blood meant innocence, then no one had to deal with the truth that anatomy is unpredictable, that purity is not visible, that a person's worth cannot be measured by pain. And so the performance continued, over centuries, across continents, again and again. Some women faked it to survive. Others faked it to protect the men they loved. Some faked it because they had no choice. And some chose not to fake anything at all. They faced the consequences. They lived or died in silence. But all of them were caught in a system that treated virginity like currency, a fragile, bloody coin that could buy status, security, or shame. And what about the men? They were rarely questioned. Their virginity was never inspected. Their past never scrutinized. Because the stain didn't belong to them. It was the woman who carried it, literally and symbolically. Even after the wedding, it stayed. If she failed to bear a child, suspicion returned. If she was too confident in bed, people whispered. If her husband turned cruel, he might bring up that old doubt. Was she even pure? It never ended. For some women, it followed them into old age. Their children's legitimacy, their social standing, their place in the family tomb. And today? It still echoes in school lectures, in family conversations, in cultural myths. We've rebranded it with softer language, modesty, respectability, values. But at its heart, it's the same stain, the same double standard, the same lie. So what do we do with this history? We tell it, we name it, we unroll the old sheet and show the performance behind it. Because medieval women weren't passive victims of patriarchy. They were survivors, inventors, strategists. They made blood out of wine. They stitched new stories into torn cloth. They reclaimed their futures in the quietest of ways, one stain at a time. And maybe that's what we carry forward. Not the myth, not the shame, but the defiance. Thank you for listening to this quiet survival story. If you made it this far, give the video a soft little like. No need to bleed for it. And tell me in the comments, what part of this story stayed with you the most? Wherever you are in the world, sleep softly tonight. And remember, the cleanest sheet doesn't always tell the truest story.